Hello, I'm Jan Peter Westad, and in this episode of the Tank Magazine podcast, I spoke with the writer Shaun Prescott about his debut novel, The Town. Published by Faber, the novel follows an unnamed narrator in his effort to research the small towns in the New South Wales region of Australia. The unnamed town he settles in is defined by fast food outlets and petrol stations. The bus driver has no passengers, and the radio station no listeners. Its inhabitants spend most of their free time drinking and brawling, and when the town starts to physically disappear, none of them seem to notice. Prescott drops us into this ominously banal world with a deadpan humour and nerve that has seen the book compared with Calvino and Kafka. We spoke about what the town might reveal of wider Australian society and some of the influences behind the novel. I wanted to know how close the descriptions are to actual towns. I understand you grew up in one of these sort of towns or in this area.
Yeah, I grew up in the Central West, in a town much smaller than the one depicted in the book. The town in the book's more of a regional centre, so that's why it's got McDonald's and KFC and all the chains and things like that. I kind of wanted to, because I'd never really expected this book to ever be read outside of Australia, and less so had I expected more than a handful of people to read it among my friendship group. So I wanted to create a town that was very familiar, but also dreamlike and slightly at a remove from the blatant reality of towns like this. Interestingly, I've had several people who grew up in the Central West basically guess the town that it's based on. I mean, of course, it's more of a mix of different regional centres in the Central West, but there was one in particular that I had in my mind.
There's a sense that there are lots of similar towns like this in that kind of area. And when I tried to get a sense of it, I sort of just did Google Maps and dropped the man. And the first thing I saw was a petrol station with a Woolworths, which is like, for listeners, Woolworths where the narrator works, and town is defined a lot by petrol stations. There seems to be an interest in the kind of culture that you're kind of, the narrator's trying to enter and understand.
The narrator is hell-bent on discovering the town's essence, and by extension, the essence of maybe the country, or the essence of himself as potentially a regional Australian-born person. But I think it's difficult to really find any firm characteristics in a town like this. Of course, as you've discovered, whether you're looking in places like Orange or Bathurst or Dubbo, you'll kind of see the same high streets. You'll see an abundance of petrol stations. But that's kind of not good enough for the narrator. I think he's looking for a more authentic image of what a township in this particular area could be, and by extension, a more authentic kind of justification or background for himself. The past always seems a whole lot more authentic than the present that we live in, I think, because the present that we live in is kind of glazed with this generic 21st century modernity, or maybe it's something that will only really identify as special if we survive another 60 years to reflect. But he's looking for an authentic idea of who he is as well. As an Australian of a certain age, perhaps he has discovered that a lot of the characteristics that Australians have long believed themselves to have are in fact not at all true. It's fairly easygoing spirit, and widely believed innocent history are easily disproven, particularly now when the culture and particularly the political culture in Australia is getting sharper and more rough as days go by.
What I liked, what I thought maybe seemed to me typically Australian, was the easygoing nature of the characters, who kind of, basically their town starts to actually disappear, but there's no panic or anxiety. It's like, it reminded me of like Tom DeLillo or Pinch and but minus that paranoia and anxiety at points, which I just thought was great because it made this kind of potentially apocalyptic moment really funny, filled with humour.
Totally. And, as a white Australian, and I can only ever really speak as a white Australian, there is that sense that, that enduring aspect of our culture where nothing could ever go wrong. We don't believe anything could go wrong, and when things are going wrong, they generally aren't directly affecting us, such as the rise of far right racism in Australia, the fringe groups that seem to be slowly bleeding into our mainstream domestic politics. That apathy is very much, I think, a kind of one of the core aspects of our identity, and it was the easiest thing to kind of seize upon and satirize in the novel. There was also the sense with writing my characters in very generic kind of chain store type environments that I was really interested in writing a novel that was set in Australia and in some ways about Australia, but didn't kind of ape the cute, charming, rural, small town mood that I guess a lot of other particularly contemporary Australian novels do. Because having grown up in these areas and in a small town, a much smaller town, one with 500 people living in it, I've just never actually got a first-hand glimpse of any of that. There's always been a kind of edge of aggression, I think, particularly among Australian males. And as I guess as slightly an outsider in rural Australia, as someone who never really loved football and someone who was quite bookish, I definitely experienced that at a young age.
In avoiding that stereotype and kind of flattening the depiction, maybe that's why it has kind of reached this audience outside of Australia. So that was something that you weren't expecting at all.
No, I've said it a few times in other interviews, but I was going to self-publish this novel because I've always loved and been involved in particularly music DIY scenes, and it just seemed like a natural thing for me to do. But luckily I found an Australian publisher, and which brings with it the bonus that your manuscript gets edited. So, and I told my Australian publisher Sam Cooney not to bother sending it abroad, but I'm obviously glad he did.
Yeah, there's a nice parallel almost within the novel where you have these bands who are making this music in the town, but it never gets out of the town, never gets even to the city, and there's this sense of cultural isolation, I guess.
That's born of a fantasy of mine that you can visit a small town in Australia and encounter this totally self-contained kind of arts or music community, and I'm sure those exist, and they do. I mean, in Orange when I grew up there were plenty of heavy metal bands, most of which covered Slayer and Metallica and all the kind of classic thrash bands, but I feel like maybe it's less likely to happen now. I feel like our kind of popular culture is so globalized, and in Australia you definitely have a sense that among listeners, perhaps less so than critics, that our cultural output is definitely inferior to the cultural output of, say, the UK or the USA.
It is a very DIY setting, I guess. It's cassette tapes and music plays a huge role in the book. You've got the heavy metal guys, but then there's this weird avant-garde about being cerebral, sort of like experimental keyboard scene where there's all these cassettes, and the music seems to convey something more immediately than words, than like language can do.
It could be due to my failings as a writer, but I've long been jealous of music for the way that it can just utterly grab you. Yeah. There are moments when you feel completely subservient to merely what is a sound. It just, more frequently, I guess, than words have ever done for me, it plays a very important role in my life as kind of a way to, as catharsis mainly, as a way to reflect and feel more strongly than I ever do on a day-to-day basis.
There's that one particularly amazing moment in the book where this strange band come out of the country and they play, it's like a recorder, an electric guitarist and what's the last one? I can't remember.
It's a bass player, I believe.
Yeah. And they just play this music that means everyone starts crying for a week or something. And it's kind of like keying into this sort of underlying psychological emotion that's within this town. When I was reading about all the music in the book, I was wondering what kind of stuff you were listening to, or you think about.
Well, in my ideal is that the music is something that, with a little bit of aid with the words, and maybe less so for the out-of-towners chapter than for Chiara's cassettes. I wanted the reader to kind of imagine their own music and to and for that to be kind of an activity and something that would instinctually occur to them and shape the book. I've always woken up with music in my head that doesn't exist. Always less so now that I've got young children and I'm up at the crack of dawn. But throughout my life, I'll wake up, occasionally and there will be music in my head that I've never heard elsewhere. And that was a great inspiration for Chiara's tapes in particular. But in terms of artists that exist and that you can listen to, there are two Australian groups called Moon Milk and Castings who are very active in the mid-2000s that inspired the music directly for me, and also stuff like William Basinski and The Caretaker. They were, the mood of that very strong sense of loss at the heart of that music was definitely an inspiration.
Some of your big influences that I've read are Kafka, kind of Central Eastern European writers, like Laszlo Krasznahorkai, I can never say it right.
I think you said it right.
Okay. They were writing sort of similar. They could kind of feel a bit end of world. The main question I'll ask is, why do you think you're drawn to those kind of writers?
I came to Kafka as a 19-year-old. A friend gifted me The Castle. Before that, I hadn't read much literary fiction. I'd read Don DeLillo. I'd read, Pride and Prejudice. But that was among the first literary novels that I read, and its influence has obviously reverberated to the extent that it even, like you say, shapes where I search for literature on a geographical scale. I've always been fascinated by Central and Eastern European writers. And I think that's because there's this utter severity that they do not... There's no sense of things being ironized or there's no hiding the importance of the work that they're writing. They take things very seriously. But at the same time, there's the oddness and the playfulness and the ability or the freedom to allow things to happen that you might not expect. That a kind of psychedelic, surreal nature to a lot of these writers and novels that I'm intensely drawn to. And anyone who reads The Town, in light of my saying that, will understand just how strong the influence is.
The novel moves to the city at the end, which I was quite surprised about. Yeah, I thought it was effective because there's this sense that once you enter the town. The narrator forgets where he came from, and there's a sense that you can't leave. You get to a certain point and there's just this kind of shimmering outline, and no one knows almost how to leave this place. And that defines the sort of reading experience and the logic where everything's kind of self-contained, and then for them to finally like break out into something that's more recognisably Sydney. Was that mirroring your own experience?
I definitely moved to the city from the country, but that wasn't why I had them travel to the city, Kiara and the narrator. There was definitely a sense of suffocation for me, having spent so long, particularly on the second part of the book, in this world, that on a kind of raw practical level, I had to get out of the town. But also I wanted there to be this sense of particularly Kiara falling into a set of circumstances where she needed to maybe rethink the way that her future would pan out. I think Kiara needed to find a new set of circumstances. She needed to find a way to endure, and I think I wanted to very briefly touch on the fact that we're definitely going to need to rethink the way that our societies function and the way that we will live on a day-to-day. It was far too didactic a pursuit to really present too clearly in the book, but I wanted there to be the sense that this version of Australia that both Kiara and the narrator were living in needed or needs to be dismantled in order for the essence that the narrator talks about earlier in the novel to maybe be discovered, or rather perhaps it shouldn't be discovered, maybe it should be remade. Maybe what the narrator is looking for is to start something from nothing rather than to try and find something within a formula that is outdated or perhaps not true or has never been true at all.
To hear more podcasts from Tank Magazine, be sure to subscribe on iTunes or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.